I want you to listen to this sound for a second. A soft thud, then silence, then another thud, coming from directly above your head, in a house where you live completely alone. Now imagine it's 1 in the morning, the lights are off, and you're already in bed, halfway between awake and asleep, when that sound pulls you back into full, sharp consciousness. Your first thought isn't fear, it's confusion. Because you absolutely know there's nobody else in that house. And that confusion, that split second before fear takes over, is exactly where tonight's story begins. Most people who go through something like this describe the same strange sequence of emotions. First comes denial, the mind trying to explain away what the ears just heard. Then comes a kind of stillness, your whole body freezing in place as if staying quiet enough might somehow undo what already happened. And only after that does the real fear arrive, the kind that sits in your chest and doesn't leave for hours. That's the exact sequence a man named Ray experienced one October night in a quiet suburb outside Tulsa, Oklahoma, in a story that would eventually pull in local police, a private investigator, and neighbors who still bring it up at backyard gatherings years later. Picture this: a single-story ranch house on a cul-de-sac, the kind of street where everyone knows whose car belongs to whom and dogs bark at the same delivery truck every single afternoon. Ray was 41, recently widowed, living in the same home he and his wife had shared for over a decade. He kept the house exactly the way it always had been, out of habit more than sentiment, everything in its place, nothing rearranged, nothing changed. Which is precisely why, when small things in that house began shifting out of place, he noticed almost instantly. A hallway closet door left slightly open when he was certain he'd shut it. A kitchen chair pulled a few inches away from the table. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make sense to call the police about. For nearly 2 weeks, Ray convinced himself it was simple forgetfulness, the kind that comes with grief and exhaustion and too many sleepless nights. Then, on a Tuesday night, he heard footsteps directly above the living room ceiling, in a section of the house that had no upstairs at all. If you're still with me right now, that tells me something about you. It tells me you're the kind of person who wants to know how a story like this actually ends, not just how it begins. So do yourself a favor and hit subscribe before we go any further, because Shadowlight Stories brings you a new, true, unexplained story just like this one every single week. And trust me, the ending of this particular story is not what you're expecting. Here's the detail that made this case stand out from countless similar reports investigators receive every year. Ray's house was a single-story ranch, built on a slab foundation, with absolutely no attic space large enough for a person to move through, no crawl space above the ceiling, no hidden second floor. On paper, footsteps from above simply should not have been physically possible, which meant, for the first several nights after he reported it, even the responding officers assumed Ray was dealing with stress, grief, or simple exhaustion playing tricks on his senses. That's the kind of explanation that feels safe, comfortable, easy to accept. Nobody wants to believe the alternative. So let's slow down and think about this the way investigators eventually did. If there's no attic and no upstairs, where exactly were these sounds coming from? Ray started recording audio every night using a simple app on an old phone he propped up on his bookshelf. 26 nights of recordings, 24 of them, completely silent. But on the 2 nights something happened. The recordings captured something the local sheriff's department still describes as unlike anything else in their files. Not one set of footsteps. 2. Moving at different paces, in different directions, as if 2 separate people were walking through empty space above a ceiling that, by every architectural record, shouldn't have contained enough room for a single person to stand upright. This is where a story like this stops being just about strange sounds in the night and starts revealing something much deeper about human perception itself. We like to believe the world works in clean, explainable ways. Floors are floors, ceilings are ceilings, and physically impossible things simply don't happen to ordinary people living ordinary lives. But every so often, a story comes along that quietly challenges that comfortable assumption, and when it does, it forces us to sit with a question most of us would rather avoid. What do we actually do with something we can hear, clearly and undeniably, but cannot explain? The twist in Ray's story didn't come from ghosts or anything supernatural, even though plenty of neighbors were quick to jump to that conclusion. It came from something almost stranger, in its own very human way. When a structural engineer was eventually called in to inspect the property, he discovered an old, sealed-off void space between the ceiling joists and the roofline, a leftover gap from a renovation done nearly 20 years earlier, one that had never been properly documented on any blueprint filed with the county. It wasn't large enough to be called an attic, it wasn't tall enough to stand in, but it was just barely large enough for someone small enough, and desperate enough, to squeeze through a gap behind an exterior vent and move along that narrow space above the ceiling, undetected, for months. Two teenagers, it turned out, runaways from a nearby town, had discovered that same gap the previous summer and had been using it as a hidden shelter, slipping out at night to find food, then returning to that narrow space above Ray's ceiling to sleep, completely unaware, at least at first, that anyone lived below them at all. Not a haunting, not an intruder in the traditional sense. Just two frightened kids hiding in the one place nobody thought to check, in a gap so small and so forgotten that even the home's own blueprints didn't know it existed. What makes this story linger with people isn't the mystery itself. It's what it reveals once the mystery is solved. Fear so often comes from the unknown, but the truth behind it is almost always more human, more complicated, and far sadder than the frightening version our imagination builds in the dark. Ray, once he learned the full story, didn't call for an eviction or press charges. He worked with local outreach services to get those two teenagers real help, real shelter, and a path away from a life of hiding in walls just to survive another night. Sometimes the scariest sound in your house isn't a threat at all. Sometimes it's a cry for help that never learned how to speak in words. I think about that a lot, honestly, how easily we assume the worst about the unknown, when so often what's hiding in the dark is simply someone who's struggling more than we could ever imagine. That doesn't make the fear any less real in the moment. It just means the story rarely ends the way we expect it to. So here's what I want to know from you. If you heard footsteps above your ceiling tonight in a house with no upstairs at all, would you investigate it yourself, or would you leave immediately and figure out the rest later? Tell me honestly in the comments, because I promise you, the answers people leave under stories like this one are almost as fascinating as the story itself. And if this one kept your attention until the very last word, send it to someone who needs a good scare tonight, or better yet, someone who's ever heard a sound in their own home they never quite explained. Some stories are worth passing along, not because they're frightening, but because they remind us that the walls around us hold more secrets than we'll ever fully know.